The doctors who performed the earliest cataract surgeries in Europe shared the remarkable stories of their clients' reactions to restoring their sight. When the doctor removed the bandages from one young girl's eyes, she took a look around her and she told the doctor that she saw the tree with lights in it. In her book, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, Annie Dillard tells us that those words about the tree with lights in it sent Dillard on her own spiritual journey. It was for this tree that I searched through the peach orchards of summer, in the forests of fall, and down winter and spring for years. Then one day I was walking along Tinker Creek, thinking of nothing at all, and I saw the tree with lights in it. I saw the backyard cedar where the mourning doves roost, charged and transfigured. I stood on the grass with lights in it, grass that was wholly fire, utterly focused and utterly dreamed. It was less like seeing than like being seen for the first time, knocked breathless by a powerful glance. The vision comes and goes, mostly goes, but I live for it. These visions are precious, those times when we see the tree with lights in it, the grass with lights in it, the world with lights in it. These numinous personal experiences of the divine are experiences that we rarely tell one another about, stories that we can't explain, the ones that might make us seem crazy in the eyes and the opinions of others. You know how Nick and I preach, how we like to share from our own and from other people's personal experiences, but I don't think I'll share these with you. These transfigurations, these shining moments when it was less like seeing than being seen for the first time, knocked breathless by a powerful glance. These moments of seeing the tree with lights in it. I remember a friend asking me to share with him some of my numinous spiritual experiences because he wondered if such things ever happened to him. So I did. I told him about a few of those precious, shining moments in my life. He wasn't impressed. He immediately explained to me how those experiences weren't spiritual, but psychological. They were projections, not connections. They were imagined, not real. In other words, he went into full mansplaining mode. You understand that males, too, can be victims of mansplaining, that patronizing, belittling, invalidating sort of talk that too many of us have to endure. No wonder we're reticent to share our stories of transfiguration, of mountaintop experiences in our lives. These are falling in love stories. They're knocked off our horse experiences. They're things that go bump in the night, or things that come streaming through the bedroom window like a half-remembered dream. Maybe when you're alone, you and I, sharing a beer or a cup of tea, huddled up and whispering secrets, maybe when we're alone with somebody that we can really trust, then we might tell each other one of these stories. There's a tradition that the gospel writer Mark used Peter as his primary eyewitness and source for the gospel that we just read. I wonder if the account of the Transfiguration was first shared over a cup of wine on a late night between the two of them, or drifting together in a boat after a long silence. Mark, I've never told anybody else this, but up on the mountain, we saw something. James and John and I, something I don't completely understand, something I tucked away in a private place, something that has stayed with me for all these years, and I still can't explain it. What really happened on that mountain? when Jesus went to pray with Peter, James, and John? Why did Jesus' clothing become dazzlingly white? How could Moses and Elijah have been there when they lived so long ago? Was this a dream? How might you and I mansplain this to Peter? But Peter doesn't want to hear it, just like you and I don't want to hear it. He is the rightful interpreter of his own experience, just as you and I are the rightful interpreters of our own experiences, including our mountaintop, our shining experiences. And Peter has his own response for that experience. He wanted to build 3 dwellings, one for Jesus, one for Moses, one for Elijah. He wanted to hold this moment forever, to capture Jesus' dazzling brightness, to make sure that Moses and Elijah didn't get away. Joy Mead, in her wonderful poem Transfiguration, imagines Peter's thoughts like this: how good it is that we are here. This is it. We have arrived. We will put up tents and shelters, chapels and churches. Others arriving at this place will see what we think we know. We'll see our attempt to pin him down. Why should we move on? Here we have found identity and meaning in the incomprehensibility of things. We will hold on to this experience for dear life and human sanity. Peter's reaction to this mountaintop experience may not have been perfect. He may have been dazed and confused and wanted to stay up on that mountaintop and keep Jesus up there all for himself. Even Mark can't avoid pointing out that Peter did not know what to say, for they were terrified. But I don't want to make the same mistake that others have made with me and try mansplaining to Peter how wrong he is, how much he misunderstood the Transfiguration, took the wrong lessons and learnings from his mountaintop experience. No, it was his. It was his, this experience. His to cherish, his to interpret, his to continue to struggle to understand. Thank God for such mountaintop experiences. The inclusion of Moses and Elijah in Peter's mountaintop experience is meant to remind us that such mountaintop experiences are at the very foundation of our faith. Moses on Mount Sinai receiving the 10 Commandments. Moses on Mount Nebo glimpsing the promised land before dying. Elijah on Mount Carmel defeating the prophets of Baal, and Elijah on Horeb, the mountain of God, and hearing the still small voice when his life was being threatened. Jesus preaching on the Mount of the Beatitudes, and Jesus being transfigured on Mount Tabor. The mountaintop experiences have shaped our faith, and they continue to guide us and shape our community's life. On the night before he was killed, Martin Luther King Jr. stood with Moses on the mountaintop. God had allowed Moses to see the promised land from the top of Mount Nebo, even though Moses would never enter that land. That stormy night in Memphis, Dr. King said, "We have some difficult days ahead, but it doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop, and I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." On Mount Carmel, in front of a multitude of citizens of Israel, Elijah, the lone surviving prophet of the Hebrew God, successfully challenged the priests and royal patrons of the rival god Baal. He not only established the power and existence of the Lord God Yahweh, Elijah also demonstrated for all to see that Baal was a fraud, was no god at all. And it makes me think of the Army McCarthy hearings called together at the summit of our democracy, the U.S. Capitol, in the summer of 1954, and broadcast live to the nation. In the most dramatic exchange of the hearings, Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy was challenged by the Army's counsel Joseph Welch to hand over McCarthy's supposed list of 130 subversives to the FBI and the Department of Defense, the list, of course, was a fraud, as was Senator McCarthy himself. Instead of producing the list, the Fox Valley's own Joe McCarthy instead pivoted and viciously attacked a young lawyer, Fred Fisher, from Welsh's law firm. And Welsh commented, "Until this moment, Senator, I think I never really gauged your cruelty or your recklessness." McCarthy casually resumed his attack on Fisher, at which point Welsh cut him off. "Senator, you've done enough. Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?" Walking out on the remainder of the hearings, Welsh said to McCarthy about his lying tactics, "Mr. McCarthy, I will not discuss this further with you. If there is a God in heaven, it will do neither you nor your cause any good." The Senate gallery burst into applause. And that was the moment that McCarthy was finally exposed as a liar and a fraud, and ultimately powerless. There was Joseph Welch up on the mountaintop with Elijah, shining forth for truth and for justice. And now, in Peter's vision, Jesus stands on the mountaintop, firmly in the tradition of Moses and Elijah, in carrying out the will of God for justice, for truth, for life. We are told that Jesus' clothes were dazzling white, such as no one on earth could ever bleach them. Sometimes we think of that shining white of the transfigured Jesus being a symbol of his purity. But one biblical scholar reminds us that the folks in the New Testament who most frequently wear white are the martyrs, those who suffer and die for the faith. It is Jesus' suffering that shines on the mountaintop. Perhaps that might remind us of the suffragettes who wore white as a symbolic of their cause. In particular, we might remember the night of terror in November of 1917 when 33 female protesters were yanked from the White House to the Lorton Reformatory Workhouse and brutally treated by the guards. Most of the protesters were hurled into concrete punishment cells where they were beaten. The three leaders of the protest received the worst treatment. Lucy Burns was handcuffed to bars above her head in a stress position, left there overnight. They later stripped off her clothes and left her in a freezing cell with just a blanket. The guards threw Dora Lewis into a dark cell and smashed her head into an iron bed, which knocked her out. Lewis's cellmate suffered a heart attack because she thought Lewis had been killed. Alice Paul tried to go on a hunger strike to protest the brutality, but the guards locked her in solitary confinement and force-fed her raw eggs through a tube stuffed down her throat. The suffragettes were finally released after 2 weeks of this treatment. And slowly the stories of the violence and abuse they suffered began to creep into the newspapers. As the news spread, sympathy and support for their movement grew. In March of 1918, their arrests, trials, and punishments were judged unconstitutional. And finally, the next year, in 1919, the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote, was passed. Moses, Elijah, and Jesus. Dr. King, Joseph Welch, Lucy Burns, Dora Lewis, and Alice Paul. We have been to the mountaintop, and God help us if we forget the visions and lessons that have blessed us there. Our mountaintop experiences are the stars that guide us along our voyage through life. They are the experiences that remind us who we are, what we most deeply value, who and what we most truly love and serve. These mountaintop experiences are not to be explained away, put down to mere imagination, but are to be treasured. and held close. There's one more movement to the story of the mountaintop of transfiguration. This is how Joy Mead describes the end of the account of the transfiguration in her poem. But there is no holding on. The cloud is upon us. We are covered in shadow and immobile in fear. He dances ahead, transfigured in his suffering, risen and free, and we must let go. So down the mountain Jesus goes, and if we would be his disciples, we must follow. Jesus could have stayed there, up on the mountain. Perhaps we even think he should have stayed there. After all, this transfigured state, attended by Moses and Elijah, his 3 disciples, was much closer to the state of glory that Jesus deserved than what was coming for him down below. Yet, he comes back down. Down from the mountain, down into the mundane nature of everyday life, down into the nitty-gritty details of misunderstanding, squabbling, disbelieving disciples, down into the religious and political quarrels of his day, down into the jealousies and rivalries that will consume those around him, down into the poverty and pain that are part and parcel of life in this world, and for Jesus, down into the injustice, into the suffering, into the death that awaits him. Down from the mountaintop. Jesus came down. And now, this isn't a story about our going up into the mountaintop. It's a story about Jesus coming down, all the way down, into our brokenness, fear, thoughtlessness, disappointment, sin, and loss. And if we would be his disciple, we have to come down too. We must come down to everyday life, to fear and injustice, conflict and pain, while clinging tight to our mountaintop visions and values. Tell me the story of how you fell in love. Then show me how you are helping your partner today. Tell me how the birth of your child was a life-changing miracle. Then express your gratitude with patient understanding of your child's own changes and challenges today. Whisper of how a friend bridged the chasm of loneliness that threatened to swallow you whole. Then offer that friend a listening ear, even when hearing the same old complaints and same old problems. Share with me how God's radical, accepting love entered your heart one marvelous day, but then share that love with somebody you may not like through an act of respect and common decency. Relate the tale of your spiritual, political, moral conversion, and then let's find one thing we can do together to make this community a better, fairer, more loving place. Because Jesus came down from the mountain, we must come down too. The one transfigured with light, glowing with love, shining in suffering, came down from the mountain to enter the dark places of this world. He still comes down with us, accompanying us in the dark places of our lives, trusting that what we have learned on the mountaintop will help ease what is hurting, heal what is broken, and love away what is fearful. Thanks be to God, and thanks be to Jesus Christ, transfigured with light, shining with love for us all. Amen.